you don't innovate, your peers will. If your company doesn't innovate, your competitors will. If your country doesn't innovate, your geopolitical opponents will. One cannot be both a conservative and a technologist at the same time. I saw a video game conference with the title Games for Change. Apparently, games for fun is no longer enough. Only God goes from 0 to 1. The rest of us go always from 1 to n. Machiavelli advises rulers to, as much as possible, not innovate. But why would the Protestants, the innovators, dislike innovation so? There is a country known for being a mere copycat. This country has purposefully lax intellectual property rights and a systematic program of forced technology transfer. At best, its citizens are good technicians. At worst, they are intellectual pirates, copying, stealing, spying. This country, Girard reminds us, is America.
For thousands of years, innovation was despised until something flipped in the 18th century and it became glorified. In the 17th century, one of the worst things you could call someone was innovator. You'd read these polemic pamphlets and they'd go, "I reject the charge of innovation. You, sir, are the real innovator." You fast forward to today, everyone and their dog wants to be an innovator, and the most derivative ventures all label themselves as innovations. Something radical shifted in the West. And here's the surprising thing. When you read the reasons why the greatest thinkers of the greatest civilizations before ours despise innovation, they actually make a lot of good points that we've completely overlooked. In this lecture, you're going to learn what the forgotten dangers of innovation are, why we've been seduced by this idea, and why it matters for innovation today.
I distinctly remember what one of my favorite professors had told me in the beginning of my first PhD level philosophy seminar. He said, "Jonathan, now that you're no longer in an undergraduate level class, for your final paper, I want you to write something original." And I didn't say this out loud, but what was going immediately in my mind was, wait a second, that's not what I signed up for. I came here for wisdom. I might settle for a few foundational truths. What does that have to do with originality? What if wisdom had already been captured? And conversely, what if the pursuit of originality led me not to wisdom, but falsehood? Or perhaps even worse, trivialities, claims which, even if true, do not matter. Now, I felt somewhat affirmed in my suspicions as I was also taking a class at the time on the great religious thinkers. And I learned that the Christian theologians were trying to do the exact opposite. They were trying to show that what they were saying was unoriginal, that it was already in the Bible, for otherwise they risk heresy. Even stronger, certain sects of Tibetan Buddhism have a terma tradition, which directly translates to hidden treasure. And the idea here is that the Buddha had systematically hidden fully written scrolls to be uncovered in the most opportune of moments. And so what scholars are saying in this tradition is even stronger. Not only is this not original, this isn't even me. The role of the scholar, at least when they're participating in terma, is of mere discovery and not of creation. So how did we get from desperately trying to show our unoriginality to, Jonathan, I want you to write something original? That is the topic of my lecture today, to trace the changing attitudes towards innovation, which of course is a close conceptual relative of originality, and the precise relation I'll make clear very soon. Part one of this lecture will be a reconstruction of innovation theorist Benoît Godin's work, Innovation Contested, which is a fantastic intellectual history that spans the Western tradition and traces how innovation changes. But why do intellectual history? Why bother ourselves with the thoughts of the long dead? Why revisit the great books of yore? After all, when we study math, we don't consult Pythagoras. When we study chemistry, we don't have to reach back all the way to Thales. When we study astronomy, we don't read Galileo. Why, when it comes to forming the right normative attitudes towards innovation, ought we reach back into the far past? Now, the answer, I would wager, is because normative attitudes do not progress like a wildfire amidst a dry field that slowly envelops, encompasses, and illuminates greater and greater terrain, unanimous, monotonic, cumulative. Instead, and I hope you'll agree after this lecture, it appears that normative attitudes change like moving a flashlight across a pitch-dark room, where the very act of enlightenment obfuscates. As soon as you move the flashlight to a new part of the room, a previously enlightened part would go dark. As soon as we tend to gain a new profitable philosophical perspective, we tend to abandon old ones in the ways in which they were valid. And so, we reach into the past not as a sterile intellectual exercise, but to rescue unduly dimmed perspectives for the current moment. Now, this exercise of rescuing old ideas, if it's to be done successfully, is almost always deeply uncomfortable. After all, it's either about prying our grip loose on our core normative commitments, or it's about introducing new ones that must, at first, seem dangerous, or at least alien. Well, I'm afraid I can't promise success today, but not to worry, I can promise quite a bit of discomfort. In part 2 and 3 in this lecture, I will ask what must be learned from this intellectual history. And I will go on to argue that our current love for innovation is a fetish and pathology that leads not to real and meaningful innovation, but derivative fashions and unwanted change. I will highlight parts of our commitment to this attitude, this fetish of innovation, that we must reject, and suggest a more classical ideal to resurrect. But that would be getting ahead of ourselves. Let's begin with part 1, intellectual history. Now, Benoît Godin's intellectual history splits the Western tradition into 3 distinct periods. The classical view covers Greek antiquity to the 16th century. The Reformation view covers the 16th and 17th centuries. And the modern view covers the 18th century to the present. Now, what's going to be most interesting to us is how and why the attitudes towards innovation changes between these 3 periods. But what are we studying when we study innovation? Is there a consistent conceptual foundation at play across these 3 millennia? I think there is. Consistent across all but one view, and I'll make clear which one that is. Across all but one of the views on innovation describes change that is artificial, deliberate, and novel. And let's go through each of these criteria and their implications. So first, innovation describes artificial change. It does not describe change, natural change, such as seasons or floods, nor does it describe supernatural or perhaps divine change, like providence or fate, nor does it capture a metaphysics or an ontology of change that permeates all, as perhaps found in Ovid or Heraclitus. But it's not enough for change to be artificial for it to be considered innovation. Second, this artificial change also needs to be deliberate. Now, this precludes man-made change that is, say, merely an emergent property or an unintended consequence of a set of deliberate actions. And what will become evidently important is that this criterion will tie innovation closely to the idea of the self as the action by which one's will and self-conception is deliberately realized. So keep an eye out for that. And lastly, innovation needs to be novel. Now, novelty is quite different than what we began this lecture with, originality. Originality, being the first to do something, is neither sufficient or necessary for novelty. Novelty is simply strangeness and a deviation from expectations. Finding a new star, well, that's original but not novel, because now we expect frequent astronomical discoveries. Now, wearing a tan suit at a presidential address, well, that's novel but original, as I've been told it's been done before. Now, novelty only requires innovation to be that species of human activity which disrupts the status quo and violates expectations, even if it is not the first instance of said activity. Innovation, then, at its core, is a social political concept, describing a specific relationship of transgression between a minority and a status quo. Now, together, the criterion of deliberateness and novelty pit innovation against another species of artificial change that's popular in the history of ideas, the natural trajectory of human affairs, or colloquially, what people do when they're left alone. Think about the invisible hand in Smith, the vicissitudes of fate in Machiavelli. Think about the degeneration of states in Plato. These are the unintended and expected behavior of human activity, a social ontology, if you will. Innovation, then, is the complement to that ontology. Those intended and unexpected acts of will that goes against this default social ontology. An entrepreneur disrupting the market equilibrium, the prince introducing new laws, right? A philosopher king rejuvenating the institutions of aristocracy. Now, in this model, human agency is expressed in history through two forces: the natural course of human affairs and acts of innovation that jerk us away from it. And so, the affinity towards innovation, or lack thereof, will be strongly determined by what people conceived this natural social ontology to be. And so, before we've even begun, I think we can already get a sense of why it may be interesting to study attitudes towards innovation. Far from just the limited technological concept that we associate it with today, innovation has been used to describe all consequential acts, cultural, political, intellectual, artistic, which disrupt and redirect the trajectory of our species. Now, furthermore, it's also interesting to study innovation because it seems intimately conjoined with other foundational concepts influential in the history of ideas: the relationship between self and group, the natural course of human affairs, and conceptions of selfhood. Following the thread of innovation and its changes will lead us to uncover a deeper change in a bundle of entangled ideas that we can reasonably call modernity. Now, we officially start our story of innovation where I suspect most intellectual histories of the West are forced to begin: Plato. Now, Plato wanted to freeze his ideal polis in time, and this is a sentiment that I think is fully audible in the Laws. In this later dialogue, we are told that the ideal polis ought to always approximate 5,040 families. The games and toys of children should be frozen in time. I quote to you Laws chapter 7. When the same children always play the same games and delight in the same toys in the same way, under the same conditions, it allows the real and serious laws to remain undisturbed. But when these games vary and suffer innovations, children have no fixed and acknowledged standard of propriety and impropriety, end quote. Of course, as an exemplar, the Egyptians are praised for fixing a rigid calendar of festivals and an unchanging set of songs and art. So why does Plato dislike innovation so? Well, I would wager that there's a concern from both the content as well as the form of innovation. And the concern from content is somewhat tautological, because in a fully good society, the content of innovation, which must violate the status quo, right, it has to be novel, necessarily deviates from the good. Well, Plato's project is to arrive at just such a thing, right? The capital G good. Now, the contingent good, not good enough, but a good that cannot be meaningfully improved, and from which any deviation is almost necessarily bad. This, then, is another foundational idea that innovation is entangled with, what we may call perfectibility, right? Whether we can conceive and achieve the full good. If we can, this Platonic line of thinking goes, let's get there and maintain it. There's no need for innovation in utopia. Now, this explanation, I think, also disarms an immediate objection. Jonathan, Plato's clearly not against innovation. How could he be? Think to the three waves in the Republic: Platonic feminism, Platonic communism, the philosopher king. Think about his rejection of the old gods and his rejection of Homer. Prima facie, Plato seems to be a social innovator. Now, indeed, Plato does not argue against innovation full stop, but he encourages it only under two very specific circumstances. The first is when the perfected organism is forced to react to change. Laws chapter 2. Accidents and calamities occur in 1,000 different ways, forcing us to make a great many innovations. Second, and much more relevant to this objection, innovation is legitimate within a deficient organism. Laws chapter 7. Change, we shall find, except in something evil, is extremely dangerous. Now, contra our modern position then, innovation is not something to be pursued in the ideal state. One only innovates in order to stop having to innovate more. But it's not just the content of innovation that Plato takes issue with, also its form. Innovations, by the fact they are novel, will inflame people's natural fetish for novelty until they start seeking difference for difference's sake. Laws chapter 7. They worship anyone who is always introducing some novelty or doing something unconventional to shapes and colors, making them despise old things and value novelty, the biggest disaster any state can suffer. Now, Plato seems to have anticipated the developments of modern art with the unconventional shapes and colors and the appeal to shock. But why is this an issue? Right? Let alone the biggest disaster a state can suffer. Well, this love of novelty, and think about it, novelty is the relation of substance, right? In some form, is a disregard of substance itself. Insofar as it is novel, not insofar as it is good, it is lauded. That is the concern. In some sense, this love of novelty, which again is the relation of substance, is even worse than introducing badness, because the love of novelty makes citizens unconcerned with questions of good or bad. It's not just abandoning the good, it's abandoning the very concern for goodness. Now, if not in its specific argumentation and formulation, Plato's general attitude towards innovation is echoed across the classical period. Namely, innovation is primarily a political and social concept. It is suspect with a slightly negative connotation, and it is only legitimate as a corrective force. And to show just how ingrained these three characteristics are, let me reconcile two ostensible counterexamples, which will further flesh out this classical view. The first discernible ancestor to our innovation is the Latin Innovatio, which emerged in the 4th century, and unlike in Plato, took on positive connotations. But observe how Innovatio is used. In the Vulgate Bible, Latin translation, Job declares his faith that his wealth will be restored. My glory shall be innovated, and my bow shall regain its youth. In Lamentations, the Jews pray for their return to Jerusalem. Bring us to yourself, O Lord, and we shall return, innovated, our days as at the beginning as before. Humanist poet Girard uses the word innovatio to describe the fiery death and birth of the phoenix. Now, I mentioned that across all but one view, innovation and its predecessors described artificial, deliberate, and novel change. Well, innovatio is that exceptional view which violates all three criteria. Even in instances where innovatio describes novel phenomena, it is almost always a much tighter subset. That which is novel, but not original, or an unexpected return to a previous state. In fact, the word itself tells us as much, because innovatio is derived from appending the prefix in, which could mean within, into, inside, to the root novitas, which means novelty. Innovatio is novelty that comes from within, or a renewal. And of course, as all these biblical examples show, neither is it limited to describing artificial nor deliberate change. So why do I suggest that this is a continuation of Plato and this classical view? Well, the first answer is that there are really two intellectual histories of innovation here. History of the word, etymological ancestors, and history of the concept, attitude towards artificial, deliberate, and novel change. Innovatio is only an etymological, but not a full conceptual ancestor. And so, the positive connotations of innovatio do not represent a break from the suspicions of Plato, as it's engendered by a different, if overlapping, concept. Indeed, attitude towards the root novitas, again, which just means novelty, without the connotation of return, took on a much more mixed connotation, where the familiar suspicions of Plato merged as a fear of strangeness. But there's a stronger point to be made here. Not only does a positive attitude towards innovatio, right, this idea of a return, not contradict the negative attitude towards innovation, there is a consistent philosophical underpinning that actually pulses across both attitudes. Now recall that I've argued that constitutive to the suspicion of innovation is a certain view of perfectibility. The good can be achieved, and any deviations after that state is to be avoided. Well, not only do supporters of Innovatio agree with this, they go even stronger. Not only can the good be achieved, it has been already, and we need to undo everything since that moment. Plato's suspicions of novelty are taken here to the extreme. The only time when the new is lauded is when it's a return of the really old. Now let's move on through time and towards the second ostensible break from the classical tradition, and that's Machiavelli. Now, while sparse, Machiavelli positively used the Italian innovare in The Prince and the Discourses. Now, some of these uses had the Latin connotations of renewal and return, but most or many of the uses did not. For example, Machiavelli prescribes innovation as an arrow in the prince's quiver of virtue. I quote to you Machiavelli here. He's listing what is required of the prince: to neutralize or destroy those who can or must be expected to injure you, to innovate old institutions with new ones. Continues listing on the virtues. Innovation, then, as it is in modernity, is a positive prescription that the prince ought do. So how is this not a break from Plato? Well, let's bring back this idea that innovation is always framed against the natural trajectory of human affairs, what I've called a social ontology, and ask ourselves this: well, what is virtue set against the backdrop of? What is the counterbalancing force to? Well, that's simple. That would be fortuna, right? The vicissitudes of fate. Machiavelli's Florence was littered with political turmoil. The Medici's twofold exile, Machiavelli's own rise and fall again, and his contacts with the tumultuous Borgia papacy. The social ontology for Machiavelli was that of one major crisis followed by another, which the ruler must deal with. Innovation in tactics, institutions, laws was the only hope that the ruler had to survive. Now, in this context, Machiavelli is not praising innovation qua innovation, but innovation in response to underlying change. Now, the other instance in the Discourses where Machiavelli recommends innovation is in the context of founding a republic and building institutions from scratch. Of course, these are the exact same two circumstances that Plato also advises innovation, in response to change or building towards the just state. Let me frame this reconciliation as such. If one were to ask both Machiavelli and Plato whether innovation had a place in an otherwise good and stable state, the answer from both of them would be a resounding no. The real difference between Machiavelli and Plato, then, is not the ostensible break in their views on the purpose and desirability of innovation, but rather the different social ontologies inherent in a utopian or a practical work. In fact, upon closer inspection, Machiavelli advises rulers to, as much as possible, not innovate, and especially not take on the appearance of innovation, because it's very dangerous to be an innovator. Machiavelli, then, also belongs to this classical view of innovation. It helps us highlight one of its most crucial features that stand in stark contrast to the modern view. For the classical view, the purpose of innovation is stability. Without it, the natural state of affairs is chaos. For the modern mind, this is exactly reversed. The purpose of innovation is disruption, a species of chaos, without which the natural state of affairs is stagnation, a species of stability. In the classical view, innovation is done to stop innovating. The ideal state does not need to innovate. In the modern view, innovation is done to engender more innovations. The ideal state is constantly disrupting itself. That's the first view, the classical view. And let us now investigate the second one before we attempt to make sense of all of this. And the second view is that of the Reformation, specifically the English Reformation. Now, in the 16th century, the English soon followed the lead of Luther, breaking away from the Catholic Church. This consequential Christian innovation, however, did not engender a love for innovating in countries where it took root. Just the opposite. It spawned a Puritan adherence to authority and a disdain of novelty. It is in Protestant England, and not Catholic Rome, that the connotations of innovation would go from suspicious, slightly negative, to evil, fully negative. Now, it's readily understandable why the Catholics would dislike innovation, right? After all, Luther's innovation had just cost them much of Christendom. But why would the Protestants, the innovators, dislike innovation so? Well, that very framing, that very question, I think betrays a modern myopia, because the Protestants would have never described themselves as innovators. The self-conception of the Protestants wasn't that they were adding on something new, but that they were revealing something very old. To them, the Protestants, it was not they who were the innovators, but it was the Catholics who were the true innovators, who've added pagan, artificial, and Roman elements, ritual, hierarchy, festivities, upon the pure and divine teachings of Christ. So it is under this intellectual backdrop and the new context of religion that innovation, alongside its negative connotations, entered into everyday English language. The new domain of religion changed the implications of each of innovation's three criteria. Innovation's artificiality was contrasted against the purity of divine works and teachings. It's because innovation is artificial that all traces of it must be removed. The deliberateness of innovation, on the other hand, called to mind schemes, machinations, and conspiracies. It was associated with runaway private opinions and liberties. And lastly, a very specific species of novelty became emphasized: deviation. Not just challenging the status quo, but taking a right status quo into the wrong direction. What is core here is that the religious domain works under very different assumptions of perfectibility than the political. Loosely speaking, political designs are made by fallible humans, whereas God prescribes us the complete and timeless good, and so there's an even greater reluctance to change. It is no surprise, then, that with the understanding of innovation as man-made machinations which deviate from the good, innovation became synonymous with heresy. Listen to how the word is used. I read to you a polemic of the time. Notorious detractors and sycophants, derogating from those things which they go about to innovate or abrogate, that so they may establish their own novelties, whether in church or state or both. Now, as the tenor suggests, innovation is no longer an abstract concept to be investigated at arm's length, put on a scale to be weighed. It became politicized and demonized. It is the mark of politicization to see a proliferation of synonyms. Renovation and Reformation jumped in popularity. Disciplinary language also popped up as people wanted to describe the phenomenon, but without using the word. Invention in the crafts, discovery in the sciences, imagination in the arts. Innovation was going on, which is not under the banner of innovation. And this highly negative connotation of innovation developed in religion would seep back into politics through the bloody attempts at English republicanism known as the interregnum. If in the religious domain, innovation was synonymous with heresy, then in the political realm, it became synonymous with revolution. By the 17th century, innovation had become a completely untouchable word. So how did innovation transform from a derided idea to a worshipped ideal that we've come to know today? The first thing to say is that this change of innovation was a symptom of a much deeper cause, where an entire bundle of entangled ideas transformed together. Revolution was also rehabilitated. Our conception of time became oriented towards the future. modern ideas of progress, reason, and individualism took root. But if I were forced to entangle the specific pathway of innovation's rehabilitation, I would tell the story of how it became associated with this idea of utility. It should come as no surprise, then, that Jeremy Bentham, the utilitarian, is the next thinker in Godin's intellectual history. Now, Bentham was one of the first to publicly defend innovation. And in the passage I'm about to read you, he's responding to Adam Smith's critique of projectors, which were essentially entrepreneurs for speculation, distorting markets, among other things. I read to you Bentham's response to Smith. "Sir, let me beg you, whether whatever is now the routine of trade was not, at its commencement, project, whether whatever is now establishment was not, at one time, innovation," end quote. Bentham's argument is this: every useful thing we have now was once an innovation. Surely there are more useful innovations that can improve upon how we do things today. And I think what this reminds me of is his fellow utilitarian John Stuart Mill's arguments, one of them at least, for free speech. Look at all the wrong ideas which we once thought were right. We're probably holding wrong ideas now, and therefore we should permit new and innovative ideas to be shared. Now, we don't commonly think of Mill in this way, but I think it's productive to understand his defense of free speech as a defense of innovation in the arena of ideas, as Bentham did in the arena of economics. Both utilitarians' arguments for innovation proceed again through this idea of perfectibility, or in this case, more accurately, fallibility. We probably aren't at the full good now. In fact, we don't even know what the full good is, so we should be open to innovations. This fallible response to the question of perfectibility is the crux to innovation's rehabilitation. And I think it was engendered through at least three discernible pathways. The first is that innovation, once it gets tied to utility, called to mind productive, economic, technological activity. Now, in these practical domains, it's natural to think that we have a long ways to improvement, that we are fallible. Now, the second pathway of fallibility is utility's association with quantification. Once you quantify something, GDP, 0 to 60 time, weightlifting, the temptation that seeps in is that the room for improvement is endless because the number scale is infinite. At the very least, one can always do better, if not marginally, fractionally so. So here's an example. Numerical and quantitative reasoning gained immense prestige through the scientific revolution, and under Elizabeth I's reign, there was a concerted effort to measure and quantify the state, which became the discipline known as political arithmetic. Now, for most of the Western tradition, the size of a state had very little to do with its goodness. In fact, it's almost the opposite, right? Plato wanted to freeze his society in laws to 5,040 families, and Aristotle often warned us of the unruliness of a large citizenry. So I think it's no coincidence that as soon as we started quantifying the state, as soon as we started measuring, intellectuals like Bacon concluded, I quote, "The greatness of a stake in bulk or territory doth fall under measure, and the greatness of finances and revenue doth fall under computation." Now, of course, today, GDP, demographics, charts and graphs seem to be all that politicians care about when it comes to the health of their nations. The insight here is this: different epistemic modes carry with them different assumptions and prioritize different ends. The epistemic mode of utility is quantity rather than quality. It's number. When framed in this numerical mode, there's an implicit admission that more is better. More can be achieved, and there is an imperative to do so. Everything starts becoming a maximalist enterprise. The third and last pathway of fallibility is simply the increase in knowledge in modernity, right? The scientific revolution, the printing press, enhanced travel, and dependable accounts of other cultures, all brought forth knowledge that really called into question what were once thought of as settled answers. And together, these pathways, along I'm sure many more, paved way for a very fallible self-conception where innovation became slowly rehabilitated. And through this rehabilitation, each of innovation's three criteria took on, again, a very different connotation. Artificiality was now celebrated. Man was responsible for shaping his own destiny and improving his condition. Deliberateness created a cult of genius around innovators. The fact that one wills a brilliant innovation into existence shows that perhaps there's something special about the innovator. And so the third criterion of novelty also becomes more demanding. Contra the Roman view, where innovatio implied novelty that was not original, in modernity, we require innovations to be novel and original. More importantly, contra the Reformation view, this novelty was no longer the new that strayed away from the good, but it became the new that brought us closer to the good. Through utility, innovation became tied to the idea of progress. And so innovation slowly began its rehabilitation in the 18th century. And initially, it was just associated with the tiny sliver of invention, the useful arts. But after World War II, it began to encompass the entire life cycle of technology that we've come to know today, from governmental policy all the way to scientific discovery, to invention, and ultimately to commercialization. Innovation, again, became politicized, but in the opposite direction, not demonized, but deified. And if the symptom of demonization is a proliferation of synonyms, then the symptom of deification must be a reduction of the linguistic set. Today, we want to label anything tangentially related and many things unrelated, completely unrelated, as innovation. And of course, the positive connotations from utility and technology seeps back into the domains where innovation was once suspected and derided. When we label something as a social political innovation today, we mean that to be a compliment. And thus we've arrived at our present moment. So let's move on to part 2 of the lecture. What does this intellectual history, the changing attitudes towards innovation across 2,500 years, have to offer us today? Well, let me tease out that answer with a different question. Why did innovation's connotations change so radically? The dominant reason must be that the primary domain of innovation had shifted. As innovation gets grafted into new domains, it ingests their connotations and philosophical assumptions around perfectibility. I mean, loosely speaking, politics lends itself to conservative assumptions. We have a reasonable idea of what the ideal state is, and the purpose of innovation is to get us there and to keep us there. Religion tends to be reactionary. We are given a standard of good by a being far superior to us. Any innovation, any artificiality is deviation. Technology, on the other hand, is inherently progressive. Not only are we not at the full good now, we don't even know what the full good is, what future discoveries and inventions that have yet to be made. We innovate to innovate some more. Innovation becomes progress. But that's not the end of the story, because the intuitions formed in the dominant domain then seep back into other domains where it does not belong. The insight here is that words are the vessel by which normative attitudes traffic across domains. We are inclined to assume that just because we use innovation both to discuss political revolutions and reforms and making of the iPhone, that those two phenomena share some kind of underlying common logic and of course, normative status. This is perhaps why normative attitudes change like moving a flashlight across a dark room, where enlightenment ipso facto obfuscates. As soon as we gain a profitable new philosophical insight in one domain, there is a tendency to extend it into other domains, occluding previous modes of thought that were indigenous and, as a result, probably more fitting. Language is the carrier by which the bacteria of normative attitudes spreads from one host where it was cultivated to another host where it does not belong. And once framed in that light, I think the answer to the motivating question of what we have to learn is quite obvious, but let me make it more obvious still. What would we say to someone who holds the Reformation view of innovation? Well, we'd say something like this. You unduly demonize innovation, right? Your dislike of innovation, even in religion, is already exaggerated, given recent events. But the bigger issue is that you've projected this completely negative attitude onto the realm of politics and utility. We moderns, then, need to be told the exact opposite. We unduly fetishize innovation. Our love of even technological innovation is exaggerated, given recent events. But even worse, we've projected this disdain of the past and love of artificial change onto domains of social life and religion where it does not belong. I think many curiosities of the modern social world become more intelligible under the light of a misplaced technological optimism. I mean, we want everything in the social world to change these days. We delight in challenging norms, in transgression, engaging in critique. Change, of course, was one of the rallying cries which Obama successfully ran a campaign on. And just the other day, I was walking down Manhattan, and I saw a banner, an advertisement for a video game conference with the title, Games for Change. Apparently, games for fun is no longer enough. Now, many people think about social progress, I think, in the mode of utility. Like we think about GDP, more is better, right? More equality, more representation, more rights. We've abandoned this idea that there is somewhat of an end or even goal to history. And instead, much like GDP growth, we also want the social world to be in a state of permanent revolution. Well, the Platonic model provides another way of thinking about the health of the polis. We want there to be moral stagnation if we've reached the ideal state. Social justice is not a maximalist enterprise, but a balancing act around an optimal point. Now, I don't think we're there, but Plato reminds us that we need to have a there in view. Now, in like manner, the highly negative views on innovation formed indigenously in the domain of religion seem much more reasonable than of those today who so readily embrace religious innovations, right? New Age trends, combining religions, arbitrarily dismissing parts of Scripture. If you truly believe that a being much superior to you has prescribed the good, then you should probably do what it says and not try to innovate your way out of it. Now, there's no reason to spare technological innovation either. Of course, as somewhat of a technologist, at least myself, I'm partial, so let me provide you a few counter-arguments that I find, if not totally convincing, then at least somewhat compelling. And to begin, at the very least, technological innovation should be suspect, for it engenders social and religious innovation, right? The Protestant Reformation couldn't have happened without the printing press. Arab Spring was facilitated by social media, and the Cold War went the path that it did because of the nuclear bomb. And forward-looking, it's unimaginable that in a world with genetically engineered babies, with artificial wombs, with people living on Mars, with robots replacing much of the workforce, that our social and even religious world wouldn't change just as drastically. One cannot be both a conservative and a technologist at the same time. Reactionary, perhaps. Progressive, certainly. Agnostic, of course. But conservative, impossible. But beyond that, technology has risk vectors, all of its own. And technology is about giving humanity more power. But it's levering up, to use financial language. It increases the volatility of human affairs. Higher highs, but also lower lows. I would wager that even in technology, innovation is overly fetishized. Because in our peaceful half-century, the higher high, innovation calls to mind the iPhone, the PC, harmless, toothless SaaS, and helpful vaccines. But there's an entire generation which experienced the lower lows, to whom technology meant gas chambers and killing machines, 70,000 warheads, and more than a few dozen nuclear near misses. Let us not forget so soon that this too is technological innovation. Now, the philosopher Nick Bostrom has an analogy that I think to be somewhat illuminating, but ultimately too fatalistic. For Bostrom, technological innovation is like taking out balls from an urn. Some balls are white and they're largely beneficial, and that's maybe, I don't know, penicillin. Some balls are gray, and their consequences are mixed, and that's, say, gunpowder. But some balls are black, and those are apocalyptic. And most crucially, in this thought experiment, or metaphor rather, this urn is opaque, and you can't see the color before you take it out. Will the printing press disrupt Catholicism? Will the displacement of workers by AI incite revolution? Will gene editing unleash devastating biochemical weapons? Over the long run, Bohlstrom's point is that innovators can't know or control the impacts of their innovations. This is the flip side to fallibility. Yes, Mr. Bentham, there's probably a lot more white balls left in that urn, but there's probably a few black ones in there as well. If we continue on our path of innovation, Bohlstrom's line of thinking goes, we could be all living to 300 on Mars, singing Kumbaya in a post-scarce world. Or we could have blown ourselves to smithereens, as we have almost done multiple times. But perhaps the most unsettling thing is that whatever path we end up on will result from our hands, but largely, to a great degree, be out of our control. When viewed on a civilizational timescale, innovation is not a rational process. It's not a Hegelian unfolding of an immanent principle. Instead, it's more like playing Russian roulette with Bohlstrom's urn. There's a legend told of the Emperor Tiberius, an inventor who comes to Tiberius very, very glad because he's invented a technology to create a piece of glass that cannot break. Tiberius calls him up and he asks, well, have you told anyone else how to create this invention? And the inventor says no. And so Tiberius immediately beheads him to protect the glass-making industry. Now, for better or for worse, not even an emperor can stop innovation today. The competitive dynamics in modernity makes it such that if you don't innovate, your peers will. If your company doesn't innovate, your competitors will. If your country doesn't innovate, your geopolitical opponents will. We are forced to innovate, forced to participate in history, whether we like it or not. For Bohlstrom, the only political structure that has even a chance at stopping technological innovation would be a totalitarian, one-world surveillance, and all three need to be true at the same time, state, which I think we can all agree would be a cure much worse than the disease itself. And so, if the two paths ahead of us are Russian roulette or 1984, then a third path starts to seem a bit more attractive. Now, this is a path that is the bane of all economists, and which every respectable, educated person will tell you to loathe. Stagnation. Marginal improvements in safe and boring verticals such as SaaS, just enough to keep our growth-dependent economy from collapse, but not too much as to engender foundational technological breakthroughs. If Bohlstrom is right, then maybe the best we can hope for is that humanity has taken the low-hanging fruits already and is too stupid or impotent to reach for any more fruits. Peter Thiel famously lamented, "We wanted flying cars, but we got 140 characters instead." Perhaps we should joyously respond, "Amen, hallelujah." Democracies have barely recovered from the trauma of social media. Perhaps it's good that they don't have to deal with winged automobiles. I think I may have angered just about everyone on the political spectrum, from social progressives to right-wing technologists. Machiavelli did warn me that it was dangerous to be an innovator. Perhaps it is doubly dangerous to try to innovate upon innovation. So let me extend to olive branches. Now first, even a cursory glance at my LinkedIn, or my wardrobe for that matter, will suffice to convince you that I'm no enemy of innovation. So let me be clear what the thesis of this lecture is. I hope to have shown the contingent pathways of technology through which innovation usurped the throne and then annexed religion and politics from which it was originally exiled and held in disrepute. I'm not pulling out the guillotine. I'm pointing out that our emperor appears to be naked. Our current fetish for innovation is an obvious pathology. but I'm not so sure what the right relationship is. I'm not saying that we're in a perfect social world. I think Bohlstrom's urn is much too fatalistic, a complete metaphor for technological innovation. And I certainly don't think stagnation is the only way out, or even that desirable. I'm not here to prescribe an answer, as much as to introduce a new question. Because in modernity, entire fields, such as innovation studies, are created with the fundamental premise that innovation is good. And the question is just, how do we maximize it? How do we accelerate it? Whereas I want us to start asking where, when, and crucially, if we should engender innovation. Now, the second olive branch I'm going to extend is much more substantive. So far, my argument against the fetish for innovation is, in part one, a genealogical critique, and part two, that it encourages unwanted change. I will now show how the fetish of innovation stifles meaningful innovation. That is to say, if after all of this, you still are, as if I confess, I still am, a writer bent on originality, a technologist, or someone who's interested in social reform, even then, perhaps especially then, you must relinquish the fetish of innovation. And for this third and final task, I turn to the philosophy of René Girard. Girard brings to the foreground a concept that has been lurking in the background across its entire intellectual history: imitation. Girard observes that the modern elevation of innovation is at once and the same a devaluation of imitation. That is to say, in the classical and Reformation period, it was okay to admit imitation of others, and of course frowned down upon to innovate, to do your own thing. In fact, a primary source of value came from your closeness to a distant ideal: Jesus Christ, Amadee of Gaul, Julius Caesar. In modernity, that has flipped. We would rather withhold this greatest form of flattery, and instead, as the modern saying goes, be our own man. We want to stand out. We want to be unique. We want to be, an individual. The source of value of the self is no longer proximity to distant ideals, but distance from proximate peers. An imitatio Christi, giving way to keeping up with the Kardashians. Now, I just learned that in the old days, there was a very funny derogatory slang used by members of the British Parliament, and that slang was chair buyer. And the implication being that one does not come from a respectable enough family as to have inherited quality enough chairs. The insinuation is that one is an upstart climbing to that position oneself. Now, of course, we also have a word to describe the exact same phenomena: self-made. And our relationship with the concept has flipped completely. Just as every self-made man wanted to show that he was not a chair buyer, now rich kids are desperately trying to appear as if they are self-made, as if they do indeed pay for their own chairs. Whereas proximity with a great lineage once lifted our status up, it now, at least to some degree, and in a certain way, tends to tarnish our achievements. He didn't do it on his own. The fear of every ambitious rich kid begins. Now, this elevation of innovation and devaluation of imitation also informs how we think real and meaningful innovation happens. The dominant modern view on innovation is that innovation and imitation are distinct and somewhat incompatible. I mean, this is how we talk about innovation in the realm of economics, right? There are innovators and there are imitators. There are those who go from 0 to 1 and those who go from 1 to n. Those who pursue vertical technology or others who pursue horizontal globalization. And those are fundamentally different people, firms, and countries. Innovators are the source of economic progress, of value. And imitators are just helping to spread innovations at best, or they're derivative leeches at worst. Now, this may not be the most sophisticated view on innovation in the academy, but this is the language that modern man conceives how innovation happens, as sprouting internally from the genius of the innovator, largely neglecting the other pathways that pre-moderns would have also attributed to, say, through the mastery of a tradition or divine inspiration. Now, Girard argues that the dominant view is wrong, and this wide gulf between the two concepts is really caused by our modern fetish for innovation. Imitation is not just an afterthought by which innovation spreads, but it is a necessary precondition. Even stronger, the dependency between the two are so constitutive to each that one seamlessly morphs into the other without a clear boundary. They are neither incompatible nor distinct. What Girard wants to resurrect are key features of the Roman Innovatio, that any meaningful change must proceed internally within a tradition, via and not contra imitation. Now, as evidence that imitation and innovation are inexorably linked, Girard reminds us that there is a country known for being a mere copycat, for making cheap knockoffs. Now, this country has purposefully lacks intellectual property rights and a systematic program of forced technology transfer. At best, its citizens are good technicians. At worst, they are intellectual pirates, copying, stealing, spying. This country, Girard reminds us, is America, 18th and 19th century America, to be precise. Americans are soon to forget that at the time, Britain was the dominant technological powerhouse in the Industrial Revolution and had an antagonistic IP relationship with America, who was trying to siphon technology from Europe by any means. The very practices of pirating that America condemns China of today are the very practices that it had to do in order to become an innovator. No act of innovation can be entirely done from a vacuum and thus must involve some degree of imitation. And no imitation can be adopted without being adapted, and thus must involve some degree of innovation. America's usurpation of Europe as the innovation powerhouse is just one of many such occurrences in modern history. Germany to England, Meiji Japan to the West. Girard concludes, I quote, "The metamorphosis of imitators into innovators occurs repeatedly, but we always react to it with amazement. Perhaps we do not want to know about the role of imitation in innovation." Girard's point here is that innovators like to believe that they are fundamentally different from imitators because it gives them psychological comfort that their position is both deserved and secure. But let us not forget, Steve Jobs took the GUI from Xerox. SpaceX stands on the shoulders of the space program, and PayPal wasn't the first to enable digital money transfers. Only God goes from 0 to 1. The rest of us go always from 1 to n. Ostensible acts of ex nihilo innovation are fabricated histories created by an idolatrous fan base, an insecure posterity, or a very, very clever marketing department. Now, the unintuitive conclusion that Girard's philosophy of innovation takes us to is that capitalism has been so innovative because it encourages imitation between competitive firms and even geopolitical rivals. But how does capitalism do this? After all, as we've just discussed, in modernity, we are so reluctant to imitate others, right? Imitation is somewhat an admission that the model is, in some way at least, superior to me, an admission that I'd rather not make. Capitalism alleviates this reluctance to imitate through the profit mechanism. For Girard, profit is a reality check, an unobjectable way of determining winners and losers amongst competitors. And this alleviates the unwillingness to imitate, because if one is on the losing, less profitable side, one is forced to admit defeat, and so there's no additional shame in imitation. Capitalism, for Girard, is a sobering and ruthless arena where losers are already so thoroughly shamed that there is no additional shame in being a mere imitator for basic survival. So what happens to domains in modernity that do not have such an objective way of determining winners and losers? Girard points to the humanities as the canonical example. Now, there's not a lot of mental gymnastics you can do to convince yourself you're winning when you're staring at a dwindling bank account and pages of red. But in the humanities, well, you can face rejection after rejection, poor reception after poor reception, and still cling on to the idea of your genius. After all, no great financier was recognized as such post-mortem, but plenty of great artists and philosophers have been. Perhaps people just need a bit more time. Now, in the humanities, the mechanism to decide between masters and disciples, those with something to teach and those in need of learning, is weaker. And so, disciples have more room to pursue the opposite strategy to imitation. They try to demonstrate their independence by systematically taking the course opposite to that of the masters, even if it goes against their own self-interests. Girard called this negative mimesis. Nietzsche called it ressentiment. Your music captures the harmony of the heavens? Well, that's great. Well, mine is painfully dissonant. You make beautiful sculptures? Well, that's great. I'll autograph urinals. Your writing is structured and systematic. Mine is fashioned after an atonal symphony, where every sentence is equidistant from the thesis. What is ironic about this strategy of negative mimesis is that it fails at the very thing it aims to achieve, independence. Negative mimesis is derivative first because one is still dependent on the model by being exactly other than what they are. Originality, especially if it's just putting a negative sign on the model, is not independence. It is derivative, second, because there tend to be trends of negative mimesis. Often, one is simply imitating one model who's breaking away from a primary model. Not even is negative mimesis not independent then. Often, it's not even original. Now, Girard gives the example of the late 20th century continental intellectual climate that was infatuated with Jacques Lacan's écrit as an exemplar of rebellion from structure, and it drove everyone to be much more incomprehensible than their peers. It was a mimetic competition of who could write in the most obscure way, couched in this language of independence and originality. Now, this example goes to show the third and other major problem of negative mimesis. Tradition, such as writing with clarity and structure, often exists for very good reasons. And so, Girard concludes, the obligation always to rebel may be more destructive of real innovation than the obligation never to rebel. The very ask, Jonathan, I want you to write something original, may end up being the greatest blocker of meaningful originality. Now, when we follow the dominant modern view and pursue innovation directly, we end up not with real innovations, and here I'm defining real innovations as innovations that are valuable beyond the fact that they're novel. What we end up with are fashions, innovations that are valuable only for their novelty. Modernity, then, has fully realized Plato's fears. Recall, Plato was suspicious of innovation because it would inflame our natural desire for novelty and make us chase after it for its own sake. Now, the issue with loving novelty in this way is becoming indifferent to the object, to substance altogether, insofar as it is new, not insofar as it is good, it is celebrated. But there is a much deeper issue here at stake. This indifference to the object is conjoined with an obsession of the self. Now, I've heard it declared many times in the tech world, I want to change the world. Almost always, I can't help but suspect the declarant cares less about changing the world than being the one doing it. This narcissism, Girard elaborates, constitutes a theology of self. I mean, think about the constitutive elements of this modern fetishized view of innovation that we talked about. The drive to be fully self-sufficient, the refusal to admit dependence to others and tradition, the insistence of ex nihilo creation, the arrogance of going 0 to 1. The constitutive components of our heavily fetishized view of innovation is evidently theological. The only being that is a suitable subject for such an action is the capital G Christian God. The modern fetish for innovation, then, at its core, is really the desire to be such an innovator. We want to have the being of God. Of course, the Christians have a word for that: Satanism. The theological critique of innovation, then, is that it represents a culture that has abandoned humility and encouraged satanic pride. We have deified the self, and innovation is our ritual of worship, our rite of passage for godhood. but we are not gods. And our desperate attempts at establishing ourselves as such would be comedic if it weren't so tragic. When finite, dependent, social creatures like us attempt to pursue radical independence, we simply imitate the appearance of self-sufficiency, that which only entangles ourselves further in dependency. We conform to contrarianism. We slavishly rally under the banner of rebellion, and we apishly reproduce the appearance of Genesis. There's a scene in a Marlon Brando movie where he plays this stereotype of independence. Biker jacket, slanted hat, at the bar, playing the drums. And he's asked, "What are you rebelling against?" And he thinks about it for a moment. He lets out a weary sigh and he says, "What do you got?" If we only stand for innovation, we don't stand for anything other than untamable pride. Place us amongst conservatives and we become progressives. Grow us in a progressive milieu and we fashion ourselves into reactionaries. Pop us amongst Christians, we become atheists. Work in the technology sector for 2.5 years and we start lecturing against innovation. So what ought we do? In domains where we want to encourage real innovation, that's a big if, and not just derivative fashions, what is to be prescribed? Because it clearly can't just be imitation. At best, Girard has shown that imitation is a necessary condition, but what are the other sufficient prerequisites for real innovation? The full formulation of Girard's philosophy of innovation is encapsulated in this one utterance. I quote, "The main prerequisite for real innovation is a minimal respect of the past and a mastery of its achievements." It is mastery and not imitation that is being prescribed. Just as innovation for innovation's sake produces comical failures, imitation for imitation's sake produces equally sterile results. Because opposites at first glance, both are really motivated by the same pathology, a radical concern for social signaling over substance, be that in seeking distance, innovation, or seeking proximity, imitation. What we are after, in both instances, is a social relation and not the content itself. Mastery, on the other hand, is concerned with the object. One masters things, one imitates people. Girard, then, is simply echoing Plato's heed to not take our eyes off of substance. The real innovator must be open to both discipleship or breaking away from tradition, rebellion, but not have either one as the phenomenological goal, so to speak. Improving the thing, beauty in art, profit in capitalism, wisdom in philosophy, that must be the only primary goal that you are aiming for. Real innovation, then, is kind of like an orgasm. It can't be achieved by being aimed at. Focus on the thing, and it'll creep up on you faster than you think. But what makes this orientation of being object-focused possible? Well, that's encapsulated in the phrase minimal respect. Minimal, as to not treat the past as unsurpassable, but respect, as to see tradition as having something important to teach us. This attitude is a middle way between the sila of idolatry and the charybdis of rebellion. And so the course which the philosopher at the helm has to chart is radically different in different historical waters to enable real innovation. In the classical and Reformation era, the danger was to veer too close to the sila of idolatry, right? Too much imitation, too much respect for the past. And the philosopher's role is to delegitimize tradition, to poke fun at it, so that more may feel licensed to break free. During our modern era, the threat is to chart too close to the charybdis of rebellion, too little respect of the past. The unintuitive conclusion that Girard reaches is that the love of innovation is precisely what is preventing real innovations by discouraging its necessary pathway, imitation, and by trapping us in social games, all while convincing us of our independence. The philosopher's role, the objective of this lecture, is to wane society off this fetish. In the final analysis, then, the fetish for innovation threatens our future on all fronts by both encouraging unwanted change and by stifling needed change. And with technology, I suspect we can no longer stand athwart history and yell stop. If we are forced to move history forward, I suggest we resurrect the imitative features of the Roman Innovatio that seeks to build the future not by cutting clean from the past, but by being rooted in and sprouting from it. It's only right then that this project of rescuing Innovatio took on the shape of intellectual history, an exercise that is in itself Innovatio. Thank you.
Thanks for watching my lecture. If you want to go even deeper into these ideas, then join my email list at greatbooks.io. You'll not only get lectures and interviews, but also transcripts, book summaries, and essays, all to help you explore the most important books in history. If you like this lecture, you should definitely check out Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morality, because it also traces a history of how modern values came to be. The main argument of that book is that everything you've learned to call morality, equality, altruism, compassion, moderation, are values designed to suffocate greatness. If you want to learn why Nietzsche thought so, and how we came to hold these values in the first place, go check out my lecture on the genealogy. You can find links to everything we discussed today, including transcripts and my book notes in the description, as well as on my website, greatbooks.io. Thank you.